Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer, and if you are watching us on our YouTube channel, and you should be, you can always take us wherever you go and enjoy your podcast content on one of the many fine podcast platforms. Just about anywhere that you get your podcast content, you're going to find the Federal Newswire's content, including the Lunch Hour. And if you are listening to us on one of those podcast platforms, please go check out our YouTube channel. Leave a like, hit the subscribe button, leave a comment, and most importantly, spread the word. Let your friends know, your family members know, and your family members' friends, and your friends' family members, all about how much you're enjoying the Lunch Hour. I am very excited to bring our guest on. It's always wonderful to talk to folks who have just, stunning achievements and who want to talk about sort of weighty policy issues that surround their experiences. Joining me today is James Lechner. He is a 1989 graduate of the Citadel and a retired U.S. Army infantry officer who served for 27 years in 6 wars, operational deployments, and operational turns in Sinai, Bosnia, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Somalia. Some of his achievements in Iraq are recounted in the books A Chance in Hell and A Soldier's Dream, and are also depicted in the movie American Sniper. He is also the author of this book, With My Shield, an Army... There we go. With My Shield, an Army Ranger in Somalia. We're going to be talking about the book and his experiences in Somalia. He has served at he has also served at the national policy level, including advising the National Security Council, the White House, and numerous tours with CIA. He holds an MA in history and teaches U.S. history as an adjunct professor at Liberty University. He is serving as a military advisor during the Russo-Ukrainian War, for which he has covered almost every major battle from the ground as a correspondent with Newsmax. Jim, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you very much for your service as the dependent of a retired military officer. I very much appreciate the work that you've done over the years.
Well, good morning. I'm very honored to be here. Thank you.
And let's start here. I mean, we're going to talk about some of the policy considerations that are happening today. You've got a new op-ed that's actually, as we're recording this, it is about to be published. By the time it's released, it will have been published probably the week before. But I want to start here, which is, how do you see the military and military service changing, and those who are serving changing? I was at a hockey game just recently, sitting next to a woman, random stranger. And as it happens, her daughter is at the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences, which is the military's medical school in Bethesda. My wife happened to attend that medical school. And she was commenting. She was a graduate. She wasn't currently at USIS. But anyway, you're just sort of commenting about the lack of understanding of military service, and how that's changed over time. How do you see this has changed?
Well, I think there's an interesting dichotomy that's gone on in the military in the last few years, really decades, but the focus has been in the last few years. You get the most patriotic people in the country, the people that really subscribe to basic American values that this country was founded on. And in the last 4 years, there's been a deliberate effort in my perspective, in my opinion, to try to twist that, to try to mold that in a different direction. I think that's been highlighted politically over the last 4 years, especially in the campaign. And now I think we're seeing a return and a resurgence to just those basic values, not using the military as a social platform by any political party, but just allow the military to stand on its basic values and really do what it's supposed to do, and that's defend the nation and focus on defense.
Well, right. It's the situation. I've had these conversations with others, which is the purpose of the military is to be used, to achieve some kind of an end where you need some kind of force to achieve that end, or at least a threat of force to achieve that end, which is why we shouldn't undertake military operations cavalierly. It's actually funny. When Russia invaded Ukraine, when they invaded Crimea in 2014, I wrote a piece, because I have a degree in Soviet studies, Russian studies at the time, or Soviet studies at the time, now Russian studies. And I wrote a piece suggesting that maybe the U.S. ought to think about putting troops on the ground in Ukraine. And I came in for some criticism, and I think rightly so, because you never put troops on the ground, boots on the ground, unless you're willing to put them in harm's way. You're literally putting them in harm's way. I dare say that maybe if we'd done that, we wouldn't have had the war that we have. But let's talk about the sort of, again, the seeming lack of understanding on the part of military leaders as to what the military and military force ought to be used for and when the threat ought to be used. Your thoughts here?
Well, certainly, and that's one of the things that I really subscribe to is the senior military leadership has become so politicized, as I mentioned before, that they have lost touch with some of the basic tenets. And if you look at some of the models for how power should be used, diplomatic information, military and economic, the military aspect should be the last resort. It needs to be, as the symbol of the United States is, eyes on the olive branch, but arrows at the ready. That's how the military should be, but it should be a last resort, because when you're going to put on the table that blood, and not just the treasure, but the blood of our American sons and daughters, that should be the last and most serious consequence of diplomacy and American policy. And I think our senior leaders have.
Well, it's interesting because again, coming back to the book, With My Shield, an Army Ranger in Somalia, by James Lechner. It's funny because I remember having very vociferous discussions with folks about whether, this is obviously the early 90s, talking about Somalia, whether or not we really needed to be there. You were on the ground, obviously, the very famous film and book Black Hawk Down, about some real tragedies that happened there. Obviously, we had a deep humanitarian crisis, and certainly as a young officer, I'm sure you weren't questioning orders or the reason for being there. But certainly there are lessons that continued from our involvement in Somalia into the post 9/11 military actions that we were engaged in. Talk about some of that.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yes, as a young officer, I really had a different perspective of what I have now. I'd not ever been deployed in a war. 6 wars later, I certainly have a different perspective. Back then, I was just anxious to get out in the field and do my job. And so
Sure,
I was really honored to be a part of Task Force Ranger and sent to Somalia, and wasn't in a position to really question the strategic perspective of the military, the administration. But now I certainly have more perspective on that. And I think that's a great example of, if you're going to put our American sons and daughters on the battlefield to risk everything for this country, then the country has to be all in. It can't be done in a cavalier manner of, let's try this, or let's send a signal and lose some people. No, because that's what's going to happen. That's the ultimate sacrifice, and the country has to be all in. And I experienced that not just in Somalia, with some huge missteps at the strategic level by the administration, but really through the war on terrorism as well, that the nation has to be committed, not just the military. We talk about the 3%ers, if that's something people have heard come up. That refers to the number of people that have served in the military, and especially in the decades of the war on terrorism, who really bore the burden of fighting that war. The nation did not feel it. And it really has to be a whole of nation approach when you're putting our sons and daughters on the battlefield.
Is that, do you think this a weird sort of bank shot question, but from what I understand, the Russian people aren't nearly feeling the pain of the war in Ukraine as they felt during the war in Afghanistan, in a different way. I mean, obviously there was a tighter control over the media, but I think more people were feeling it when they would see the zinc coffins arrive from Kabul. But from what I understand, the Russians are largely insulated from this conflict. Do you think that's part of what helps to drive Putin along in all of this?
I certainly do, and it's really a fascinating study. Well, the Russians should come in for great criticism on many of the things they've done. One thing that they are excellent at is propaganda and information control, and Putin is really a master of that. He's gone back to almost a Stalin-esque control of that country. We would not think in this day of the internet and mass media and social media that it's possible, but they have it locked down. I obviously haven't been to Russia, but I've got lots of people that I know inside Russia and correspond with them. and it's really like a Stalin-esque type tyrannical government there that locks down that information. And the other thing that they do that they did significantly different from Afghanistan is, Afghanistan's a foreign war, kind of obscure objectives, sound familiar, right? But what Putin has done
Yeah.
very effectively, they have a different mindset there in the East for history. And what Putin has done very effectively is he's framed this in the context of the Great Fatherland War, World War II. You notice they're talking about they're fighting against Nazism. This is protecting the Russian people, the motherland. So he doesn't talk about political borders. He talks about Russian-speaking peoples that are Russians that should be back under their control.
Right.
So very effective at framing this and tapping into, and you know as well as I, tapping into some cultural tenets that they have where they're going to bear this burden. They approach we could talk about this all day. They approach casualties and loss very different than we do. As a society, they do not mourn high casualties. We as a society mourn an individual loss. They don't do that in Russia. They see that culturally as the sacrifice from Mother Russia, and they're willing to accept incredible casualties, especially when framed within the context of the Great Fatherland War.
Sure. So let me ask you this, just to turn back to Somalia, and again, the book With My Shield, an Army Ranger in Somalia. We had friends serving over there, and if you were on the beach or near the Indian Ocean, you had a great temptation to go swimming. Did you ever hear these stories about the shark attacks and the dangers and folks being told they couldn't go and swim
off the beach in Mogadishu?
Yeah.
I talk about it in the book. Actually, the day of the battle.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
Yeah, another soldier. The battle initiated on a Sunday, and we almost had somewhat of a day off, and we went to the beach. And a soldier from another unit, thank God not our unit, but another unit was killed by a hammerhead shark on the beach while we were swimming.
It's just crazy. I mean, you're there, you're dealing with the warlords, you're dealing with just the fog of war, and then all of a sudden this happens. Yeah, we had a classmate of my wife. His wife was deployed over there. It was just crazy. So let's turn our attention to the last couple of years.
Sure.
And let's talk about the experimentation, and let's talk about our veterans. Now, obviously, how we treat our veterans, those who served and put their lives on the line and came back with some horrific injuries, some horrific psychological injuries. We how are we doing now? We haven't done a great job. Doug Collins is now in as secretary at the VA. But this is, Charlie Wilson warned about this, actually it was Gus Avocados, and Charlie Wilson's War warned about this. You win the victory at the one hand, but then you lose the game down the road by bungling things. In many ways, we have lost the game when it comes to our veterans. I'm hoping Doug Collins is working diligently. I think he's working diligently to get it back. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. I think veterans, the definition of a veteran, according to the Veterans Administration, the U.S. Federal Government Veterans Administration, is someone who has honorably served and completed their term of service. And so I think that's a very important definition. And there's a lot of things that come with that, a lot of inherent things that mean that you've achieved by having just done that baseline service and being honorably discharged. And I think the first thing that we need to look at is, because we have an all-volunteer force, these are people that have stood up and volunteered to sacrifice everything if need be. And sure, there's other incentives, but at the end of the day, everyone knows or should know when they come in the military, you may be required to sacrifice everything. And people are cognizant of that. They're doing it for their family. They're doing it for their country. And they've done that. And if, as a veteran, if you've served honorably and served your term of service, I think the nation has a debt to people that have done that, especially when we talk about the context of this is a volunteer force. Very few people serve in that capacity. Very few people aren't even in a position to give back to society. And the military has done that. And there's a lot of military personnel and veterans have done that. And so I think there is a debt we owe to people. And I don't think we're serving our veterans very well in this case. And I think we can expand upon that. Yeah. But I think it's really an intersection of, need and people that we owe a debt to, but then an intersection of federal bureaucracy. And I don't think there's an intent to disrespect our veterans or not treat them fairly, but it's federal bureaucracy to really a mind-numbing, and I've experienced this, you've probably seen this, to a mind-numbing degree of what the federal government's trying to do on one hand with their bureaucracy and then serving veterans. And it's an intersection of kind of the planets coming to alignment for problematic things. And so I think that's really a good thing to focus on, the Veterans Administration.
And it's interesting because it actually leads us into sort of the meat of what we wanted to talk about today.
Sure.
There are very clear areas where we need reform, right? As we talked about, the issue of experimentation, social science experimentation in the military, and how that impacts, readiness and effectiveness. And then the bureaucracy in terms of how we serve those who have, put their lives on the line, some for many, many years. And so that leads into this issue of we're at a time where reform is necessary, isn't it, Jim?
Sure. It sure is, especially like we alluded to, especially in the last 4 years. There's been social experimentation and things using the military for that. But especially in the last 4 years, I think we've seen how far left it's gone. And certainly now there's a time to reform that, to do away with the things that are just, beyond insane and not practical, and then see some opportunities within that as well.
Well, listen, one of my favorites is the idea. Now, I had a conversation a while back with a guy named Matt Lesser, who's an economist, and we were talking about the fiscal impacts of sort of the regulatory state, because that's my other bread and butter. And we got to talking about the idea, like when you put mandates for things like green jet fuel for our jets, our helicopters, et cetera, it makes them less effective. It makes them vulnerable in terms of supply chains. And it also makes everything more expensive. I mean, this is part of what we're talking about, but we're also talking about the idea, right, that you would try to make military vehicles, combat vehicles electric. And it's like, okay, well then our enemies are just going to put their defensive positions just out of range of of tanks or armored transports or whatever. I mean, it really is a backwards way of looking at things, isn't it?
Oh, 100%. And, that's been the position. I'm very involved in social issues and defense policy issues. And that's really the position you have to take. It's not what your personal preference is, but it really comes down to capability. And when you're talking about someone or an organization that's defending you, defending your family, defending the nation, all these other factors become secondary at best. What is the primary factor is capability. And I'm very happy to hear Secretary of Defense Hegg talking about that, because it is much less an issue of, are we going to conform to some environmental policy or issue, or we're going to have some sort of social equality? That really has nothing to do, or very little, if anything, to do with the military's purpose, which is to defend the nation. And that all comes down to the greatest capability.
Right. And that's why, the great thing about the American military, and obviously mistakes have been made over time. We're going to talk about some of that, but it is sort of the ultimate expression of meritocracy, right? You are supposed to rise and fall. You succeed and fail based upon your abilities. And we reward those whose abilities are exceptional, or at least we should. Talk about this. Talk about the issue of meritocracy and what may have been lost over time. And also incentives versus disincentives to recruitment and retention.
Well, yeah, 100%. And you can take this example exponentially in the discussion. But, I really ask people, especially, and let's just focus on women in the military for a minute. I've experienced lots of examples of serving with women in the military. Any individual that brings patriotism and work ethic and cognitive ability to the table is an asset. But really, again, when it comes down to the military, is capability. And you can't ignore biology at the expense of some sort of social justice or progressive agenda. And so I ask people, if you were in a burning vehicle, would you rather have a male or a female come try to pull you through the window? If you were on an operating table, would you rather have the most qualified doctor or somebody that we were given a chance and they didn't really cut the standard? Those types of things. If I'm clearing a building, I want the person on my right to be the strongest, the best shooter, have the most endurance. And it doesn't matter if I like them as a person or not. And it really comes down to capability, and that extends across the board in the military.
It's funny because it's one of those things where my wife thrived in this environment. Third generation Air Force. So I mean, I know in the Army you would say she was hua all the way. I mean, without a doubt. Obviously, with the Air Force, it's a little different. And so, she, in order, by being the best physician and the best leader, I mean, she is an exceptional leader. She was when she served, an exceptional leader. She loved that. She loved that aspect of it. And then there are, of course, the things that drove her up the wall as the face of the military changed. She's hearing stories about, younger personnel complaining about, not being able to have long fingernails, and it's like, don't you understand what we're all here for? There's that disconnect. So obviously reform is needed. And this gets into the op-ed that you're having published, or that you will have had published this last week. There is the danger of going too far, and you talk about caution. Talk about this. And it's absolutely true. I mean, I'm someone who believes in policy by deliberation. Talk about this.
Well, I think that the task in front of the current administration is so huge and so vast, and they have such a limited amount of time to achieve what they need to achieve just by the dynamics of our government and politics, that there's going to be broken glass. That's what we've been talking about. I know lots of great people that are getting pushed out of the government, but it's the cost of doing business, and it's not a personal thing. It's the conditions have been set by the opposition, to be honest, in my view, in my opinion. And so the Trump administration has to do what it has to do within a limited timeline, and that means there's going to be some broken glass.
And Jim, hold on for a second, because I want you to continue with this. But I mean, you're finding, and I'm certainly finding this, the dealing with the level of anger at folks, and again, folks that some of whom I don't quite understand, others I understand perfectly why their positions have been eliminated. But that anger is palpable, isn't it?
Oh, well, it is. There are, it hurts on the individual level to lose your job. But what I tell people is this is not the fault of the Trump administration. This is the fault of 50 to 75 years of bureaucratic inertia and an effort to create a bureaucratic inefficiency in the government. I mean, it's been a deliberate effort, a jobs program, and the American people deserve better than that. And the Trump administration, the prescient thing that we have with the second administration here is they learned the first time. They learned that the government's not going to cooperate with them. There is a bureaucratic deep state. They're going to oppose them. We're seeing them do it now. So their only recourse is to break some glass, is what I like to say. And I think it's unfortunate, but I do laud their efforts in trying to fix the government. And I specifically drill down on the military.
Listen, as I keep saying, we have a government that spends $7 trillion a year. We have revenues of $5 trillion a year. That's pretty much the maximum we can take in, even if we tax everybody without wrecking the economy entirely, given the percentage of our GDP. And so, let's assume for a moment, though, that even we can make up $1 trillion in the shortfall. That's still $1 trillion that we're missing. We have to cut $1 trillion in spending. That's a not insignificant sum. And so it really is the issue of breaking glass, right? In case of emergency, break glass. We are at that point. So let's actually, before we get into some of the specifics here, let's talk about the importance of our veterans. And the important things that they bring to an economy in terms of experience, what they lend to businesses and the business world.
Well, sure. And if I might just kind of amplify and make a segue here,
Please.
With all the things going on in the government, I see this as an opportunity because I'm very dedicated to giving opportunity to veterans, to promoting veterans, and to doing the best thing that we can for them. And I see this as an opportunity. So as we reform some of the problems, we reform the bureaucracy, we reform some of the DEI type of policies, I'd like to see this refocused as an opportunity to serve veterans and promote them in the economy and in the workforce and put them forward as one of our best assets.
Right. I mean, that's exactly it. I mean, it is switching over and recognizing that if we are doing fewer things, maybe the things that we do and have to do, we can do them better. I mean, that's a portion of what you're saying, isn't it?
Sure, it is. And I was in the military for 27 years. I've got about over 35 years of service. And throughout that whole time, kind of the focus was equal opportunity and justice, that no one should be shut out for any individual circumstances, that they should have an opportunity to prove themselves. DEI is a twist on that, a perversion of that, if you would. It's that someone is going to be put into a position because of their skin color. And I think that's an insult to everyone, but also to minorities. It's an insult to them. But what we should focus on and go back to, and I hope this is an opportunity to do that, is ensuring that there's equal opportunity. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be systems in place to ensure there's equal opportunity, to review promotions and hiring things. There should be, but it should be from the perspective of, let's ensure everyone has an equal opportunity, not that we're specifically selecting. And if I could, I can tell you, I think personally, there's a number of egregious examples, but for President Biden to say a Black woman had to be the next Supreme Court justice, that's an absolute insult. That's an insult to people, because that's a biological approach to a meritocracy, a merit-based position. So I really think that's the way we should go in the military, is focusing on equal opportunity and then ensuring that it is merit-based, because that's what the military requires for capability.
But at the same time, right, we're not going to go down this road, because you talk about throwing out the baby with the bathwater, which is a phrase that I love. We have to recognize that there are things that the other side might say are DEI that are not DEI. And we need to make sure. So, for instance, there are organizations that are geared towards promoting women in the military, but also, allowing women in the military to come together and share ideas. Because as you point out, right, there are some unique challenges that women face. This is not about doing away with those kinds of things, and shouldn't be about doing away. And maybe in those instances, we're going a little too far, right? There should be opportunities for women in military medicine to have conversations about things, or women who are facing challenges in leadership, who might need to be able to have conversations with other women about how to be better, more effective leaders in an environment that has been largely male-oriented. But what are your thoughts here?
Well, yeah, and I'm the father of 3 daughters. I've got a granddaughter, so I'm very sensitive to that aspect, and I don't think that I take a chauvinistic approach toward women in the military. As I stated, some of the best soldiers I've served with, some of the best people I've served with, happen to have been female. But we also need to recognize that there are differences between men and women, and again, that's kind of the basis of our opposition to the Democrats and the left. They don't want people to recognize those differences. They want to just throw people together. And one of the things that really I'm focused on and really pains me is we've created these conditions for the high levels of sexual assault, for the high level of trauma that females experience in the military now, because we've taken this blinders on approach to, let's just throw them all together and let the chips fall where they may. Well, biology is going to dictate where the chips fall. And I think we've done a disservice to the females who serve in our military by creating those conditions. And it really it comes back to leadership. It comes back to leaders understanding what the purpose of the military is. And the purpose of the military is not to give some 100-pound girl who has the heart of a lion, the chance to put on a bayonet and clear a trench. It's biologically, it's not going to be feasible, but give her an opportunity to serve in another way. The leaders that allow that to happen don't have an understanding of what we're really trying to do. So again, to me, it's a difference between equal opportunity and DEI. And I'm pretty pleased with the way the administration is approaching it initially.
So let's take the next step and sort of look down the road. How can we guard ourselves against throwing out the baby with the bathwater? What kinds of thoughtful approaches can we be taking that promote and protect, let's say, veterans programs from being somehow thrown into the DEI mix? What do we need to do?
Well, I think the first thing is that we put some emphasis and prioritization on veterans. And as I said, under the Veterans Administration definition, which I completely agree with, and I think that's proper. And if you're in that classification, if that program is a common sense, and again, another thing I like about the administration, a common sense approach to giving veterans equal opportunity, let's focus on that. let's understand that, yes, these are people that have made a sacrifice to the nation. We owe them at least an opportunity, and let's focus on giving them up that opportunity in a common sense manner. Again, another way is that, as we talked about, having systems that monitor and ensure that these are executed properly.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me because people seem to forget. I remember having this conversation with somebody a while ago about while my wife was still serving, about some of the opportunities that were made available to us and things that we were getting. And this person was surprised and a little angry. And I'm like, but I don't think you understand.
Right.
My wife can be sent away at any point in time. She can be deployed. She's, put in harm's way. The sacrifices that are getting made by both the serving military officer or the serving military member and their families is huge. I always regret that I didn't do more as a spouse. I was in a unique environment. Being a guy and then having a career wasn't quite the same thing. Let me ask you this, Jim. Well, first of all, I mean, let's tell us a little bit more about the book, With My Shield, an Army Ranger in Somalia. How long were you over there? What can folks expect in the book?
Yeah, well, that Somalia with Task Force Ranger was my first combat deployment. I was a young lieutenant, newly married, had a baby on the way. It was literally on my last 30 days. I'd been in the Ranger Battalion about 3 years. It was my last 30 days in the battalion. I had one more exercise to go on when we got the word to go. My company was not selected to go on the mission, but then they needed some individual augmentation. And as soon as we got that word, I was pulled out of my company and joined B Company for the mission. So really a once in a lifetime experience, although I've had a number of those since then in 6 wars, but really my first major operation, really an incredible opportunity. You knew you were making history. There was very little going on militarily at the time. So the focus of the nation, in some ways the world, was on that mission. I wrote the book because, having said all that, generations have gone by now, and I meet a lot of people that don't know anything about it. And I just think the story of the sacrifice of the guys that went, and the honor and the perspective that they had being in that kind of unit, is an important thing. And it ties into our discussion. This is a great discussion today because I talk about a lot of those things. This was 30 some years ago. It was a different culture, a different army. And again, we've certainly thrown the baby out with the bathwater on a lot of things. There's always ways to improve the military. There's always ignorance and things that we can overcome. But we've certainly thrown the baby out with the bathwater on our approach to military training and military philosophy and the warrior spirit that's needed in a unit like this to be able to accomplish things like this. So I talk about that. That's one of the themes that I run through in the book. So it's a great opportunity. And I've been very honored to put the book out and honor those guys.
Were you ever on the ground in the Balkans in the 90s? Because I had friends who were.
Yeah, my second war was I participated in Bosnia. I wasn't in a lot of fighting there. Okay. Most of the combat operations had terminated by the time I arrived, but I did serve for over a year in Yugoslavia, in Bosnia Herzegovina.
I was very close to a couple, and he was a Special Forces reservist, and he was over in the Balkans. And I never forget, there was a front page Washington Post story about the sort of the psychological efforts over there, winning their hearts and minds.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, I wonder if my buddy is mentioned in this. And there was a picture of him on the front page, which was kind of funny. So I always ask my guests this, because if I hadn't done this podcast, I was going to do a podcast called Outside Interests, where we talk to people about the stuff they do that isn't political or policy oriented. What do they do in their spare time? There's a Senate staffer I know, for instance, who plays guitar in a band, and somebody else who plays blues harmonica, and someone else is a photographer. When you're not writing, when you're not thinking about these things, when you do have some spare time, what are some of your outside interests, Jim?
Yeah, I'm a big history guy. Like I said, I teach history for liberty. So I bought an old plantation, a 200 some year old plantation in South Carolina. So I'm restoring that. I'm not a great handyman, but I've gotten a lot better in the last 10 years working on that place. I'm trying to restore the historic garden. So again, very amateur, but I'm restoring the garden there, so I like to do a lot of that. But clearing the land, rebuilding it as a garden, rebuilding the house. That's and I get a lot of peace and a lot of that's my center to go to and kind of renew myself up there. So
amazing.
Yeah, that's a great touchstone for me.
I have a child who went to college at Charleston.
Oh,
a child who went to the college of Charleston, so I spent a lot of time down there over the years, and we actually had an event. She had an event at the Citadel once. Jim, the book is called "With My Shield: An Army Ranger in Somalia," available on Amazon. That's where I got my copy. How do folks find out more about the good work that you're doing?
I'm on Facebook primarily. I'm on X, especially as a Newsmax correspondent. I got a full suite of social media.
That's right.
So X, a little bit on Instagram, but again, I appear on Newsmax occasionally, write for the Washington Times, Soldier Fortune magazine. I do a number of things like that. So that's the place to catch me, X and Facebook, and great podcasts like this. So I appreciate it.
Thank you. We're gonna get you on. I spent a lot of time working with the Newsmax guys in
Great.
the various radio gigs that I have. Jim, thank you so very much for joining us. Our guest has been Jim Lechner. He is an author. He is an Army veteran. The book, of course, again, With My Shield, an Army Ranger in Somalia. Go and check that out. As I said at the top of the show, if you're watching us on YouTube, go and check us out on one of the many fine podcast platforms at which you can find the Federal Newswire's Lunch Hour podcast. If you're watching or you're listening to us on one of those platforms, check us out on our YouTube channel. I'm your host. I'm Andrew Langer. Thank you for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.